Hello, friends. I'm Abhinav, and we are back with our second event after the Mahana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. This is very special for us because this is the first book, and the book is on counterterrorism, which has been my area of work and also area of a lot of writing. I have personally worked in Jammu and Kashmir, so this is something which is very dear to me. And we bring our first ebook, Counterterrorism Trends, and we have like some really amazing new experts and new scholars who have worked on various aspects of terrorism. I'm not going to take much of your time, but since I have more or less I got a chance to edit this book and review all the different papers, so I'll just briefly share my thoughts. I personally feel that the book is really very diverse and varied in its coverage, and it talks about with many new different aspects of terrorism. Dr. Pathak has written on the double standards of China in its approach to counterterrorism. That is something which India has been a victim of, and we have always tried to get Masood Azhar banned in the UN Security Council, but China has always, I mean, that they've all obstructed our efforts in the recent past. Also, I'm not able to recollect the name of that Lashkar terrorist, but I think he's number third in the hierarchy, and they tried their best to put spanner in the wheels. And this is very important because this is also part of China's strategy to keep India busy in Kashmir so that they can concentrate in the Malaccan Straits and keep all their stuff intact and do a lot of things in the Indo-Pacific region. Ivanshu and Mahak wrote about SCO and role of India in counter-terrorism. Now, recently we had this SCO meeting, and people really question. I also personally question what is India's role in the SCO, given the fact that you have China sitting in the SCO, you have Russia sitting in the SCO. Now, Iran and Pakistan also playing some role in the SCO, and on the other hand, India is getting very cozy, very friendly with the US. This relationship is strengthening. The logical development of the global geopolitics also dictates that India becomes more and more closer to the US. So that really brings a question: is India going to be just a marginal player in the SCO? And most of the states who are the part of SCO, they have stakes in some of them have stakes in sustaining terrorism, at least in the Indian side of Kashmir or the various parts of India. Like Pakistan is supported by China. Iran also has a very bad track record as far as terrorism is concerned. Israel happens to be India's great friend. So we all question India's role in SCO. Certainly, that's a very interesting area to look at. Mr. J. Mania wrote about the development of ISIS in the East. Personally, this is something which I have felt even in my city also. ISIS as an organization may or may not be that important, but ISIS as an ideology has certainly impacted the Muslims across the world, particularly in the subcontinent also. Though we don't have a huge number of people joining ISIS from India, but as far as ideological influence is concerned, that's certainly massive. In the recent past, only last year in my city, which is a very remote and sleepy city, in fact, so there one ISIS-style beheading took place, and the fellow who perpetrated that heinous killing was a routine man, and one could never suspect that he would be stooping, he would be getting to that level. So on that issue of blasphemy, he slaughtered a man and beheaded a man, just inspired by those ISIS videos. So that was a shocking and chilling development. Certainly, I mean, if this area needs to be studied, that I mean, what the influence ISIS ideology has on the common average Muslims in the East as well in the other parts of India also. Another chapter that focuses on Western ideas and Indian context applicability of resilience literature. These days, we are all talking about Indian theories, Indian context, Indian perspective, mostly in the IR. In fact, our foreign minister also, Mr. Jaishankar, also wrote a book in which he's talking about giving importance to Indian traditional, Indians mythological discourse on international relations, particularly deriving theories from Mahabharata and various ancient texts. In Usanas Foundation also, we have organized several events where we have focused on some of these traditional texts. But yes, India's approach to counter-terrorism deserves a very special focus because unlike the West, India has been the victim of terrorism for the last 3 decades. I mean, it all started, particularly it started in 1990, but even before that, we were facing terrorism radicalization in some of the other form. So in the West, terrorism became a focus area after the September 11 attacks. But even before that, for like almost for 10, 11 years, India was a major victim of terrorism. And India could devise a strategy when world refused to listen to our voice on terrorism, on particularly in Kashmir or even in Punjab, we faced a very brutal form of terrorism. And in those days, we didn't have much technology. The economy was in a bad shape, and the resources were poor. The governments were politically unstable, and internationally, India had not much voice because India's best friend Russia had completely disintegrated. So, in that context, India's response to this major internal security challenge emanating from terrorism was very crucial, and India developed its own mechanism. So we do need to study, India's approaches to counter-terrorism and the resilience literature also. And certainly, one can take a leaf out of it, when one has to deal with radicalization and terrorism, particularly in South Asia. It may be very useful for the US State Department, for the UN also, when they deal with the radicalization and terrorism related problems in South Asia. Maritime security and terrorism was another area on which Mr. Manhas wrote, which is again becoming a major problem for India. Identity crisis as Pakistan's instrument of radicalization. Mr. Niranjan Marjani wrote on this, and this is a very relevant and very crucial topic. As we see in the recent past, Pakistan is going through major churning, and for Pakistan, the use of religion has been a major source of creating a fictitious identity because. In essence, Pakistan has always been a very diverse country. Pakistanis, there are Punjabis, and there are Baluchis, there are Sindhis, then you have Kashmir in the north. All these regions are not very compatible, not very happy with each other. There are a lot of rifts. But the general opinion is that Punjabis dominate the Pakistani strategic establishment, intelligence services, political setup. So there are a lot of divergences. To counter that, they used religion, they used Allah to create a fictitious identity. And that became a source of not just state building, but a massive radicalization, which became a headache for India, Afghanistan, and the entire world. As we saw that Pakistan's presence in terrorism-related cases, happens to come up almost everywhere. Then the bioterrorism was also discussed. Mr. Tanwani discussed about combating terrorism, again, India's approaches to counterterrorism and transnational organized crime. Here, linkages between terrorism and transnational organized crime is one area where certainly we need more resources and more attention, because in India's case, this is very relevant, as Dawood Ibrahim, the fugitive, who was involved in the Mumbai attacks, was basically a mafia, a transnational gangster who worked in Mumbai, and he has facilitated the work of ISI and various terrorist groups in the past. It's not just the Mumbai attacks that his role is confined to, but he was also very active in facilitating the entry of Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists in Gujarat after the Gujarat riots on various occasions. I would also like to thank Ararat for contributing a chapter, and we were very late in informing him, but then he was kind enough to write a chapter. I have personally written a chapter on Popular Front of India. That's not an outright terrorist organization. I mean, certainly it has very strong relationship with terrorism and radicalization. But for years, this organization flourished as a charity organization which engaged in providing education, academic staff, and various other welfare schemes. Now, that becomes a major problem for India, because India is a democratic country. And if you have white collar organizations of, working perfectly in a very legal framework with all the permissions and licenses and all, and proper legitimate funding and various other sources of funding, it becomes very difficult to launch a crackdown upon them. It's very difficult to like put them to task. It's very difficult to get them hooked in the law, because they are legal organizations. Organizations like Lashkar, Jaish, and Hizbul Mujahideen, they are terrorist groups. They are involved in terrorist attacks. But the organizations which prepare a very firm infrastructure, the whole ecosystem of radicalizing the masses, and finally they end up, supplying recruits for the terror groups and creating an overall ambiance of hatred and radicalization, which also contribute to creating massive communal riots in the society. They are these organizations like PFI, and they are a much bigger threat, because terrorism or known incidents or scattered incidents of terrorist attacks can still be tackled by intelligence agencies or, let's say, security forces. But such organizations like PFI, who are involved in massive radicalization, they have linkages with the transnational terror groups, extremist groups, and state actors like Turkey and Pakistan. They play a much more pernicious role in the society, because they indulge in massive radicalization, which leads to communal riots and this propagation of bringing Sharia state across the a very large section of the Muslim society in India. So that becomes a major internal security challenge to the state of India. And it is not just an internal security challenge. It is also a social problem. It is also the psychological problem. And it is also an economic problem in various ways. So certainly that needs more attention. So finally, I would like to say that the areas which have not been covered in this book are mostly dealing with the online radicalization and the online terrorism. Certainly, that can be taken up by the new scholars, or in the future they can be taken up by other scholars, and also the radicalization by some of these organizations like PFI. They needs to be taken up in more details. So I'll just end here, and I would like to thank all the writers for sending such beautiful and insightful chapters. And when writers are so insightful, the task of the editor becomes very easy. In fact, it was a great learning process for me also. Also, I would like to thank all of you. And with this, I would like to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Michael Rubin, who is a special guest for us today. And he has been associated with Usanas Foundation since June 2020, like the day when we started functioning. And a very, very warm thanks to you, Dr. Rubin. Please, share your thoughts on this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, so much, Dr. Pandya. Look, it's a pleasure to be here. When I read the book, I always approach these books with a great deal of cynicism, because when people, terrorism analysis, terrorism studies has become sort of an industry where people strive to repackage established wisdom, but seldom contribute anything new. And this book certainly was the exception to the rule. That's why I became so excited to read it as I went on. It doesn't talk around the issues. It doesn't simply repackage ideas. This is the exception. That there are absolutely new and rich information. The book makes anyone who reads it think, and that goes for pretty much every chapter in there. James Dorsey wrote a great foreword. When we talk about root causes, I have to admit, my back goes up, because oftentimes it becomes a diplomatic means to avoid the true problem, which is the ideology, the radicalization of some of these folks. Not everything can be explained by poverty. Not everything can be explained, as Robert Pape might want, by land disputes or so forth. I'm not accusing James Dorsey of doing that, but it's important to keep the focus on ideology. And then through this all, we saw how the ideology played with a lot of new problems. I was very much struck with Dr. Pathak's chapter on China, and this is the key issue: is China tries to punch its weight on the world stage, no longer restrains itself diplomatically. Certainly, China isn't the first country with a double standard when it comes to terrorism, but any relationship with Pakistan is going to delegitimize China's own assertions with regard to terrorism. And this is a problem which I don't think Beijing might try to paper over, but there is no papering over, especially with just the sheer enthusiasm of the embrace that actually in this case goes both ways, from Beijing to Islamabad, from Islamabad to Beijing. I also thought that Dr. Marjani's paper on radicalization and terror as a source of identity in Pakistan was quite eye-opening. And certainly this is a problem which Pakistan is going to face into the future. Yes, I absolutely agree that Pakistan was an ethnic hodgepodge. Perhaps Jinnah, by dying so young, failed to put his stamp on what Pakistan might have become, what he meant when he talked about an Islamic State. And while Pakistani officials will still talk about a soft Islam as a source of identity, sometimes I think that they never get outside Islamabad, or if they're living in Islamabad, never get outside the Islamabad club to actually see what's going on in Karachi, what's going on in the different areas. It's also well and good to say that that ethnicity has been solved. But when someone says ethnicity as a problem in Pakistan has been solved, you've been talking to a Punjabi, because everyone else seems to have a problem with that. and that people are pumping up this extremist Islam, interpretations of Islam, in order to paper over the very real fissures that impact Pakistani society. And frankly, I'm not sure that Pakistan can survive without its embrace and its distraction of radical Islamism. Every U.S. policymaker certainly needs to read this paper, Dr. Marjani's paper, because look, I mean, too often in the West, we gear our policy to the wishful thinking of what we want a country to be rather than what it is. We calibrate our policy to the strategic environment 20 years ago. We tend to be amazingly obtuse in actually dealing with the reality. The fact of the matter is the Cold War is over. We have a burgeoning relationship with India, which from the US standpoint is bipartisan, and we've got to seriously rethink Pakistan inside the United States, inside the West, because not because of India, but because of where Pakistan is going on its own terms. Pakistan can't blame outsiders for the decision it's made. I spent about a year at sea over the last decade teaching for the U.S. Navy, and so I found Neeraj Singh Manhas's paper really fascinating on regard to maritime terrorism. I hadn't thought about this as much in the context of India, though certainly there's a lot there. I would say that when it comes to the USS Cole, what a lot of people forget is that the Cole had sailed out the day before through the Strait of Hormuz with a full complement of supply ships. It didn't need to go into Aden to refuel. A lot of people forget that the reason why the USS Cole went into Aden, where it was struck by terrorists, was because Secretary of State Madeleine Albright had wanted an excuse to pump money into the Yemeni economy. And so I just highlight the issue of how diplomacy plays into maritime security. If we take a security first, almost like a security quarantine for all our assets in the region, the impact it's going to have on local economies. With something as large as the U.S. Navy, when they need to resupply, if they can supply from the local market, that's important. Terrorism is a way of undercutting that local market. I was fascinated separately, and I'm sorry to bounce back and forth, by the notion that 70% of Islamic State Khorasan recruits are Pakistani nationals. That's also something that should be a wake-up call when it comes to how the world addresses Pakistan and the burgeoning problems within Pakistan. Back to maritime terrorism. One other issue which I would highlight with regard to maritime terrorism, which is important, and this is something which the Egyptian Navy has suffered and which was an attempt on the U.S. Navy, was false SOS, false rescue operations. When someone needs a rescue at sea, the nearest ship needs to respond. We had an issue, and this was covered by site monitoring back in 2015, where an Egyptian fishing boat claimed that they were sinking. An Egyptian frigate came to their defense, upon which they were set upon and crippled by missiles fired by the from the Sinai coast. Now, a similar operation started to unfold not long after, I think around 2016, in the Red Sea, where a U.S. Navy destroyer was the closest ship. And in order to conduct this rescue, after having received the Mayday call, it ended up becoming a huge military operation with helicopters, with Navy SEALs, to ensure that this was a legitimate Mayday call rather than having a U.S. ship walk into the trap. One question, given the preponderance of shipping, whether it's small-time fish shipping, whether it's huge container ships that pass by India, there's going to be a huge issue in how to deal with maritime rescues should terrorists try to use that context in order to lure shipping into a trap. Now, with regard to Dr. Pandya, and again, I want to, just express my sheer amazement at the Usanas Foundation and everything which Dr. Pandya has achieved over the last couple years. I read his articles in American publications. I read his articles in Indian. Again, without an exception, not only you, but every member of your team is actually contributing rather than simply repackaging in some sort of fancy dialogue. I found that you're absolutely correct about radicalization. I'll be a little bit less diplomatic. De-incitement is always a problem. What I see in the US context is we have so many snake oil salesmen. So many people come and try to sell their latest de-radicalization formula, and a lot of it is absolute nonsense. We as the West, we as democracies need to figure out how to separate the wheat from the chaff, how to really focus on the problem of de-incitement and de-radicalization. I would say that de-incitement is as much of a problem as de-radicalization. I found your article on Popular Front of India to be fascinating. What really scared me is when you wrote that there's 50,000 active members in Kerala alone and more than 300,000 sympathizers. I mean, basically saying this is a huge problem. And we've also always had a problem of feeder organizations. We've seen that in Morocco leading up to Al-Qaeda, leading up to the Islamic State. We see that in India with Tablighi Jamaat in the past and so forth. The West needs to do a much better job, and especially democracies, of identifying what a feeder organization is. Because certainly there's a pattern here, which isn't just the case with regard to the Popular Front of India. It occurs with various foundations in Muslim Brotherhood organizations in North Africa, in the Levant, in Turkey as well. This is a huge issue. As a democracy, we've got to get, I mean, there's got to be much better counter-terrorism cooperation among democracies and a recognition that some of these groups, and you've written about the Khalistanis before as well, aren't as legitimate as their propaganda would like them to seem. With that, let me turn the floor back over, because I know you've got a very full program. I just want to conclude by saying how radically impressed I was by this publication, and how much I regret that. My biggest regret is, after reading it, not hearing the papers firsthand at your dialogue, because I had a conflicting schedule conflict. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin. I would love to, since you have already started the, discussion on radicalization, I would love to discuss more with you, but definitely, we have speakers, so some of the time, but, this is a very super interesting area. Before I invite the other speakers, I'll just narrate one small incident. So there was this organization in Jammu and Kashmir, Jamaat-e-Islami, initially functioning as a perfectly religious, legitimate organization, running orphanages, schools, colleges, and also like superficially aiding the local administration in containing the unrest. They used to incite the unrest, and then the local administration would approach them to help them contain the unrest. Finally, after doing all the groundwork, and they were also a very important, nodal authority for all the terror financing business in JK. Finally, after doing the ground research and everything, I mean, I was doing a lot of work on that. Then finally, I had discussions with some people from the retired, people from the state intelligence community and also the central intelligence community. They were out of the service, but then, so in those informal discussions, we asked them a question that, what is the way out? They said that, sir, legally, these organizations have a very strong network. They are deeply entrenched in each and every village. They have a very strong network. They have a political presence, social presence, administrative presence, and if they bring finance from, let's say, UK or any other European country, it is very difficult to establish that linkage. So what's the best way out? Then finally, some of them said that, well, it's the business it's not about poverty. It's not about economic deprivation. They play upon the religious card. So they suggested rounding up at least a few hundred main coordinators, and neutralizing them. Now, that was something very shocking to me. I asked them a question that, is there any other way, something which is a step short of neutralizing or eliminating them? And those retired officials, they said, no, sir, we have not come across any other way. Because these guys work in a very strong legal framework. If you ban them, they will come up with some other aliases, some other new names, and some other offshoots and some feeder organizations. They'll start functioning again with the same freedom and same authority. So the only way is to round up some of their key coordinators, who are the pillars, who are the strength of the organization for their international operations as well as domestic operations. If you get rid of them, then that brings that's a major dent in their strength and in their penetration. So that was something very shocking. Yeah. Anyways, but thank you very much for joining us today, and definitely, you'll be staying with us for the rest of the event. I see Ambassador Anil Trigunath, sir, has also joined, and sir, thank you very much for joining us today. I know you were flying and you were traveling, so out of your busy schedule, you could join us. Thanks, sir. Sir, would you like to go first, or should we invite the authors first?
No, no, I could be and as you have planned.
Okay, perfect, sir. Perfect. Okay. Ambassador Trigunath, I would like to give a special thanks to Ambassador Trigunath because he is one of the pillars behind the success of the Maharana Pratap annual geopolitics dialogue, and also a great expert on West Asia, former Indian ambassador to Libya, Jordan, and Malta, and member Usanas Advisory Board, and a great human being, friend, philosopher, and guide for Usanas Foundation. So any of the young scholars who want to make a career in international relations, I would suggest them they must read his articles, and if get a chance, personally meet him. He's a very interesting and a very supportive human being. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. So I think I'll invite Dr. Pathak just to speak about his chapter. So we have about 5 to 7 minutes for each author to share his thoughts on the chapters.
Thanks a lot, Abhinav, and thanks, Usanas, for having this and for doing all the brilliant work that you've been doing. So I'll stick to maybe 5-6 minutes, but requesting either Abhinav or Preeti to just stop me at maybe when it's 4 minutes 30 seconds, so that I know I should wind up, because this is a topic which is quite huge and I can go on speaking on it. So this chapter which I've written is called Tracing the Double Standards in China's Approaches to Counter-Terrorism. And I've decided to call a spade because there's a lot of dubiousness as far as China's approaches to terrorism go. In order to, set the entire discussion into motion, I first would like to talk about just 3 examples of, these terrorist attacks when Chinese nationals were attacked, and the kind of response which China gave out. So last year in 2022, there were these 3 Chinese nationals who got killed in a targeted suicide bombing in Pakistan outside University of Karachi's Confucius Institute. But obviously, the Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned the terrorist attack. They expressed indignation. Moving a year further back, in 2021, there were 9 Chinese nationals who got killed in a shuttle bus explosion in North Pakistan. The shuttle was on its way to the CPEC's Dasu hydropower project. And as per Pakistan's investigation reports, a branch of the Pakistani Taliban was responsible for this particular attack. In 2021, again, there were 2 children who were killed and 3 wounded in this attack, which was trying to target Chinese nationals in Pakistan's Gwadar. Then going further back, in 2018, there was the Balochistan Liberation Army, BLA, which attacked the Chinese Consulate General in Karachi. 2017, there were 10 workers who were killed by gunmen on motorbikes, etc., etc. So there are these scores of examples of Chinese nationals being killed in Pakistan. Each instance of terror attack against Chinese individuals who are abroad, and I've just given the examples of Pakistan because I want to talk about China and Pakistan. Every time there's been an instance of a terror attack against Chinese individuals abroad, there's been a very strong condemnation which has come from the Chinese state. Beyond this condemnation which came from the Chinese state every time that there was a terrorist attack in Pakistan, China has also tried to suggest that it might be India who has tried and perpetrated these attacks. For example, the state-run tabloid Global Times. It's hilarious, of course. Global Times is hilarious, but let's not forget that it is state-backed, it is state-run. And a member of the party is actually the editor of the Global Times. Anyways, Global Times had suggested that, and this article from last year, it suggests that the Majid Brigade of the Balochistan Liberation Army has close contacts with India. Without travel permits granted by the Indian state, Majid Brigade's visits to India would not be possible, etc. Churning out the usual narrative against India in every single aspect. The interesting part here is that while it would even try to showcase that, some of these attacks which have happened in Pakistan, India has an involvement, within the aegis of regional cooperation organizations like the SCO, which, Abhinav correctly questioned at the beginning of this webinar, Within SCO, China calls for a concerted effort to tackle international terrorism. India and China are both SCO members. Pakistan also is. In fact, we have also decided, India, all the members actually, in one of the previous SCO summits, that we will exchange lists of the organizations or individuals we consider as terrorists. Now, within the SCO, at the RATS, which deals with terrorism, it's a concerted effort to deal with terrorism within the SCO. There has never been any condemnation of, jihadi terrorism, which is the main concern for India, and China will never even do that. So within SCO, it says we need greater collaboration. We'll give you out lists, and China will give out a list, which India will have to accept. But when India will give out the list, and because it will be jihadi terrorism emanating primarily from Pakistan, in all probability, the double standard will become even more visible because China will not accept it. As Abhinav had stated, while within Pakistan, Chinese nationals do get attacked by terrorist outfits, China protects these terror outfits at the level of the UN's 1267 committee. And last year alone, in 2022, China blocked 5 India-US proposals to get Pakistan-backed individuals sanctioned as terrorists. And this was just over a span of 4 months. So in this context, it becomes very important to understand and call out the dubious stances which China takes on tackling terrorism. It hosts the largest concentration camps in modern day history in Xinjiang to tackle domestic terrorism. It continues to tacitly aid and abet international terrorism emanating from Pakistan. It shelters, banned outfits like Alpha, which primarily operate in India's northeast. It shelters Alpha. Alpha's leader, Paresh Barua, is still in Yunnan. And at the same time, China wants to project itself as a responsible player, which, would talk a lot about terrorism. But when it comes to action on the ground, there is a completely different approach. So in order to understand what is China's, whole approach to terrorism, I talk about the 3 evils in China, which is this concept. In Chinese, it's called Sanpu Shili, which refers to the forces of separatism, extremism, and terrorism. And back in 2017, Xi Jinping had stated that this fight against the 3 evils, terrorism, separatism, extremism, is a long and arduous task. In very simple words, without going into the nitty-gritties, these 3 evils are aimed at countering these emotions or any sort of secessionist activities in Tibet or in Xinjiang, as simple as that. Now, to counter secessionist activities in Xinjiang or in Tibet, China needs the help of international players, be it Pakistan or be it SCO members. Which is why, if you just take a look, and in the chapter, I've given out this long list of the number of meetings which have taken place between 2020 to 2022 between heads of states from Central Asian countries and China on just the issue of 3 evils. And it's a long list, goes into 5 pages, 5-word document when I was writing it out. So it's quite a lot. So China needs support for countering, these 3 evils within China. But that's about it. Beyond that, what happens beyond its boundaries beyond its boundaries in other countries, China has a very dubious stance. And then I talk a little bit more about the 3 evils just to lay out an understanding. And then I move into this section about how there's a divergence in India's and China's approach to cross-border terrorism. China's 3 evils are very different from the way we in India understand, terrorism. Now, among the biggest divergences between India and China's approach to terrorism is, of course, with respect to Pakistan. Let's go back to 2017. On June 28, 2017, a day after India and US based Pakistan. I'm sorry, that's my doctor. Just give me 2 seconds. Can you please move them out? On June 28, 2017, a day after India and US asked Pakistan to rein in cross-border terrorism, China put up a defense of Pakistan, stating that Islamabad has been at the front lines of the fight against terrorism. And Chinese foreign spokesman Lu Kang, he told reporters in Beijing, and I quote, "China thinks that international cooperation against terrorism should be enhanced and stepped up. The international community should give full recognition and affirmation to Pakistan's efforts in this context." So, on the one hand, it lauds Pakistan's efforts. On the other hand, as I mentioned in the book, and as I mentioned at the beginning of when I started talking, there have been at least 5, 6 attacks in just the last 3 years, which have targeted Chinese individuals within Pakistan. But yet, why would China really do this? It condemns all these attacks. It, bilaterally, it goes and tells Pakistan that you need to get your house in order. You need to get things in place. But then internationally, it would use this very dubious stance. So it's difficult to understand, but it's high time that a recognition of this dubiousness exists. So what is very weird in China's protection of Pakistan, or China upholding so-called counter-terrorism efforts by Pakistan, as I said, is that Chinese nationals again and again get attacked in Pakistan. So this makes it very clear that this issue of terrorism is just a tool for China to further its nefarious objectives against India, while trying to continuously shield its own territories in Xinjiang and Tibet by talking about three evils, getting countries like the SCO countries or Pakistan to cooperate with it. Now, another divergence in the approach to seeking international cooperation on counterterrorism is observed in the way in which there was a visa which was granted by India to Dolkun Isa, who is the leader of the World Uyghur Conference. Back in 2017, the visa was granted to him by India because there was going to be the World Uyghur Conference. China, of course, raised a big hue and cry, and China protested that he's a terrorist on the Interpol's red corner list, etc. It's the obligation of all countries to bring him to justice. So India immediately cancelled Dolkun Isa's visa, and Isa claimed there was no reason which was given to him by the Indian authorities for the cancellation of this visa. Now, this is despite the fact that China continuously shields Pakistan from international rebuke for its sponsorship of terrorism and shielding state-sponsored terrorists from getting listed at the UN's 1267 committee. As I briefly mentioned, even last year, there were 5 times when China actually blocked efforts by US and India to list, terrorists who have bases in Pakistan. And, these names range from Abdul Rahman Makki. This is a long list, so I'm not going to go into that because there's a paucity of time. It becomes very clear from China's actions that there's a divergence in the way it speaks and the way it actually responds to terrorism, when it's happening in the neighborhood, especially in India. Its approach to terrorism in Pakistan, again, is a whole different ballgame. So China wants international cooperation to tackle the issue of terrorism. What it should do, as far as the principles of reciprocity go, is that it should at least respond in the same ways as it expects other countries like India to respond. It shields state-sponsored terrorists because these state-sponsored terrorists do not affect China's sovereignty. They will not get listed as part of the 3 evils. They may target Chinese economic interests or citizens in Pakistani soil, but that's that. In fact, in responding to a question on what could be the motives of the attack on the Confucius Center in Karachi, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin, he stated in 2022, the iron brotherhood between China and Pakistan cannot be broken. This is bizarre. Like, no one's asking about, the iron brotherhood. So when these sorts of statements are made, the wording is very important. What is the need to mention China and Pakistan's iron brotherhood in this context? Questions are just being asked about terrorism in Pakistan. This narrative, of course, there's a narrative creation which is going out here. And there are a lot of nefarious motives which need to be called out, which need to be understood. If truly there has to be a win-win approach to international, cooperation on countering terrorism, then the first and foremost step is to understand the dubiousness so that India and other democratic countries stop falling into this farce that, China or Pakistan, for that matter, would actually take some concrete steps as far as terrorism is concerned. So I'll just end it here. I hope I have not crossed the time limit. Thank you so much for paying attention.
It's okay, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patil. Thanks for such an insightful review of your chapter. And now the question is that, given the situation in Pakistan and the way it is heading towards a very classic, movement towards collapse, it'll be wondering, it'll be really amusing to see how China reacts. Thanks again. and I can understand. I mean, this. Thanks for keeping within time, because I distinctly remember it became such a big challenge for you as a presenter in the Maharana Pratap dialogue to keep the speakers within the time frame. And finally, we had to bring a small bowl and a spoon. Next time we'll be bringing a small bell. So I'll invite the next author, and whoever wants to go first. Ararat, would you like to go?
Right.
Would you like
Yes,
to
I would
go?
like to. Yes.
Yes.
I would like to congratulate all the participants in this book and Usanas Foundation as well for bringing this idea forward. Well, my intention writing about the Muslim Brotherhood was for two reasons. First, when I was looking to the publications when the Syrian crisis started and later it went into a war, that the majority were writing about mainly either the Muslim Brotherhood can be the alternative to come to power. The second one, why the Muslim Brotherhood was taking the lead in shaping the coalition of opposition. So the idea was not very clear in terms of the ideological debate was missing, and partly it was a bias when we were looking to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood that were in exile, yes, but we had previously the history that Muslim Brotherhood participated in Syria in such same activities, and it was banned. But the situation here was totally different due to the rising, the so-called Arab Spring movement and demonstrations. So for Islamists, it was a new chance, and that's why there was the misreading that this time Muslim Brotherhood might be more changed and they might be more tolerant towards the rest, and etc., etc. But we have seen what the process took in Egypt. There was a big also enthusiasm that Muslim Brotherhood is coming with new leaders, with a new image and with new perspective, etc., etc. And after that, we've seen what happened. And again, the same story. And again, they hosted, again, it's banned in Egypt. What coming in Syria, we know that it took different direction to civil war. And we know the catastrophic image that Al-Qaeda and ISIS jumped in, etc., etc. But here the point that reading and defining the ideology that Muslim Brotherhood brought with them was not clear among the scholars and among the policymakers. They were just seeing that that could be an alternative to the government and might be bring something positive. But they started from the beginning to chanting that they will cooperate with all opposition factions, etc., etc. But what we've seen on the ground, when the peaceful demonstrations started, they started to back the factions. They were every Friday chanting sectarian slogans against not only Christians or other minorities, but against the Muslim Syrian locals. They don't believe the agenda that the Muslim Brotherhood were going to bring. I mean, that is a big bias when you want to come as an opposition, even if it's a crisis or even if it's a peaceful electoral situation. You cannot rely on your same previously intolerant Qutbian or Wahhabi ideology and circulating the same scenario again and again, and being intolerant toward the rest and imposing your will and imposing your exceptionalism in the Islamist arena as well. I mean, this point is very important, that both Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, at the beginning, they were saying that we will cooperate with other parties and we will cooperate with other even minorities on the social ground. But in reality, when the chance they came to change situation, either to take power in Egypt or either to start using arms against the government in Syria, they started to change their attitudes totally. And they started again to show up the same minority that they want to build a Sharia state and they want to impose their will, not only, as I said, to the population in general, but they want to impose their will on the Muslims that they don't want to live under Sharia law, and they don't want to follow the Muslim Brotherhood. Here is the identity crisis as well, that I believe that it's very important, because they want all the time to impose their agenda. Muslim Brotherhood is the solution, and there is seems like there is no other any solution to the Middle East with coming new image or new outlook. So the other reason that I believe they had the biggest mistake in cooperating with regional powers, that they wanted to force their agenda. Everybody started to think that his agenda, for example, Turkish agenda, Qatari agenda, will be better option for Syria, without asking what the Syrian majority people want. The protests started from the beginning. It was nothing related on Islamic agenda or whether they wanted to change a government with an Islamic organization. They were just chanting protests that they wanted better living conditions, economic conditions, more rights. But all of a sudden, we've seen that the Muslim Brotherhood emerged to the arena. And when the coalitions were formed, they even didn't let the other coalition parties, they were from different social fabrics, to take their initiative as well. And many factions started to come out from the coalitions, and they started to blame the Muslim Brotherhood, because every time they were willing to impose their will, even in the coalition parties or institutions. And the third level, which brought them to, I believe, to biggest failure, is that they started to cooperate with the terroristic organizations during the armed struggle the Qaeda and later ISIS started. And some factions from the Free Syrian Army, who were backed, some of them, by the Muslim Brotherhoods, and plus Muslim Brotherhoods started to invent their militias as well, started to cooperate with terroristic groups that they intended from the beginning that they are different. They were presenting themselves that they are the alternative to the extremist and fundamentalist groups, but at the end it turned out all cooperating together. That was the biggest mistake I believe the Muslim Brotherhood have done in Syria. So they totally lost that intention that they could be a politically wise group to be in Syria. What about the counterterrorism issue? I'm not an expert on defense and security.
Ararat, I request you to wind up soon because it's exceeding the time.
Regarding the counterterrorism issue, I'm not an expert on defense and security issues. I'm an IR expert, but what I try to bring in intention of the reader is that there are many intellectuals within Syria, within Middle East, and in the Muslim world that they are presenting the progressive Islam, civic Islam, and I wrote about that also in my article, to make a clue that not the solution to secular governments is the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. There are many ideologues coming today that they are putting forward the idea of progressive Islam that will be based on humanism, not will be only based on the ideology that the Islamists brought, and precisely the Muslim Brotherhood. And I gave also some hints on what's going on within the Muslim house in Southeast Asia, for example. There is the very popular notion now, Islam Wasatiyya, which talks on the moderate Islam. And I believe that is also a vision that we have to focus on it, and we have to nurture that moderate Islam vision and progressive Islam vision. That was my idea, to find an alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ararat. Muslim Brotherhood is certainly a key area of interest for India also now, because as per some of the recent reports, they are trying to find a foothold in India also, and coordinating with some of the local Islamist groups like Jamaat-e-Islami and PFI. Yeah. So moving on to our next speaker, I'll invite Kritika. Please come and share your thoughts, and please keep it 5 to 6 minutes, Kritika. Kritika, are you there? Kritika? She was here. Yeah. Can you hear me, Kritika? Hello, Kritika?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please share your thoughts about your chapter and keep it 5 to 6 minutes.
Sure, sir. So first of all, I would like to thank Usanas Foundation for this wonderful opportunity. My work on resilience literature and trying to situate that within the Indian context of counterterrorism is fairly new, I would say. So the biggest challenge I faced when starting out this study was trying to find works that were even related to this field, given that resilience literature in itself is a fairly new concept. And just like terrorism, resilience too has a very evolving definition. So a lot of different disciplines have attempted to define resilience, but it has remained a largely Western concept. And my study has tried to bridge that gap and bring this concept to the Indian context. And it is still a very first step in that direction. So in my book chapter, I mainly looked at the works, the counterterrorism measures that were there in the UK and in India. And I primarily focused on a few approaches that were very similar in the way they were carried out. So from the UK side, I looked at the prevent strand of the contest strategy and Project Champion. And on the Indian side, I looked at the NatGrid surveillance issue that was being raised in 2021 and the de-radicalization measures that were taken by the ATS squads of Maharashtra and Kerala. In terms of how these approaches were carried out in both the nations, of course, there are a lot of differences with regards to the structure, with regards to the institutions, but there are also similarities, which was the most interesting part for me, because both the nations were sort of trying to counter Islamic radicalization, but it also had a flip side to it because they landed up policing rather Muslim communities a little more than they did the other communities. And that sort of created a sense of suspicion within those communities as well. With regards to including resilience literature within the Indian context, I felt that we do use the vocabulary here. Sorry, the vocabulary is slightly different when you view it in the Indian context, but the ideas are there. So when I was going through the Indian counterterrorism approaches, a lot of ideas with regards to resilience were emerging, except that we don't use the exact terminology as they do in the West, which was very interesting because resilience is an evolving concept and a lot of work is to be done in this field, especially community resilience, which is a very interesting area. So yeah, I hope I summarized my chapter well. And again, thanks a lot for having me today here. Thank you.
Abhinav, you have to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Ritika. Thank you very much for keeping within time. And there's certainly an area where we need to devote a lot more effort in terms of papers and in terms of discussions. Now I'll invite next author, Rahul. Rahul?
Yeah, am I audible?
Just let me check this. Yes, it's Rahul. So please share your thoughts, Rahul.
Yes, firstly, thank you so much for having me over here, Abhinavji and Preeti. And I would like to thank Usanas Foundation for giving us an opportunity to put forward Indic perspectives and Indian thoughts, which have often been largely ignored over a passage of time. And having an idea and having this opportunity to make these contestations in this day and age also brings us to an acceptance that where Indian thought is really going with it. Um, as you would have seen that my chapter is more from a legal realm, if I may put it that way, where I am dealing with perspectives of law and specifically international law. And within the international law arena, I have made a contestation that there is now enough state practice available to show that the crime of terrorism and combating terrorism, its financing and connected money laundering can become part of customary international law, or in other words, qualify as customary international law. So therefore, while going into that realm and with that particular issue in mind, I have termed it as a case for the Pied Piper, because customary international law is that area of law which per se cannot either be hijacked or hostaged or held hostage by a state when it comes to something like treaty negotiations or conventions or formal treaty laws. Uh, Keeping that in mind, as I have gone with my chapter, I have chronicled Bharat's state practice, as we have seen in the last 30 odd years or so, starting with the formal acceptance of the treaties, which was the Convention on Suppression of Terrorism Financing and the Convention on Combating of Transnational Organized Crimes, where India has been a state party, and how it has incorporated these two laws and international laws into its domestic systems. And while doing that, I have also chronicled various other international developments that have taken place. For example, the 1994 and the 1996 UNGA declarations, which for the first time formally accepted terrorism as a threat to humanity as a whole, and showed the resolution of the world how to go about it. And one may really land up seeing, if they want to put time periods and evolution on this particular area, the 9/11 becomes really a turning point as to how state approach towards it changed, and rather than just being reactionary, it also became more preemptive in nature. The prelude to it was with the coming of the Suppression of Terrorism Financing Convention in 99, or slightly prior to that, and the resolutions for targeting finances of Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and Taliban. But 9/11 is really where we see that the UN and the world community on a whole took it as a legislative drive, where emphasis were put in that the world has to unite really how to combat these particular issues, and a uniform legal regime is required. That is why you will see a more dynamic approach that came not just at the United Nations level, but also what spilled over from it at national levels. Uh, if I may just take a minute to just summarize that before I go to the India perspective. If you look at the resolutions that have started from resolution number 1373 of 2001 to all the way till 2019, where the regime has been very well developed with the Counter-Terrorism Committee, the Ombudsman Committee, and seeing that enough of transparency comes in sanctions and listing is one such measure. But now coming really from the India perspective, which is key over here, is that India's positionality and contestation has been seen rather quite expressly in this case, starting with the 1947 Act to enforce UNSC decisions, which arise from Article 41 of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, to the amendment of the UAPA Act, to the orders passed, and to the Money Laundering Act. India has shown its commitment time and again at the national sphere by incorporating these international legislations and commitments. Coming down to its other international treaty obligations and diplomatic obligations, India has hemmed and created the draft text for the Comprehensive Terrorism Convention, which came up in 2007, and the efforts had started post the 94 and 96 declaration. This really shows India's uniform contestation and uniform stand it has taken that qualifies as a state practice. So coming now back to the issue of customary international law, as we progress to my chapter, you would have seen that the whole idea of customary law is based on a dual principle of state practice and opinio juris, where these legal issues and legal obligations become binding and consistent over a period of time. So how do you chronicle state practices? You see every state's practice and whether it is meeting the international standards they have laid down, that is laid down by the UN, laid down by the FATF, which has evolved slowly into a quasi-hard or a quasi-soft law to push these particular regimes and obligations in place. And one would really see that if one sees it holistically and on a macro understanding of it, one will realize that these state practices have not just been uniform, that it is so overwhelming that even without the definition, accepted definition of terrorism, the elements are out there for the world to grasp and understand. And therefore, in light of that, similar state practices should be chronicled so that a consensus can be developed as to this qualifying as a norm of customary international law and moving beyond treaty obligations that are dependent upon state enforcement and state acceptance. So that is really the sum and substance of my chapter. Thank you.
Abhinav, unmute yourself.
Thanks, Rahul. Definitely, all these the legal nuances in counterterrorism and the international law pertaining to the counterterrorism are very critical to us personally. This is, I mean, there's not an area of my specialization. I mean, so definitely, the chapter was more of a learning for me. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll invite Rideep Singh to share his thoughts on this chapter.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good evening, everyone, and I would like to thank the Usanas Foundation for once again providing me the opportunity to present my thoughts. So my name is Rideep Singh, and my chapter deals with evolution of terrorism, and I look at the emergence of bioterrorism. The chapter starts with me arguing that with conventional terror tactics like suicide bombing, bomb drops, mass shooting, hijacking, hostage taking, the motives are to incur mass casualty and panic. However, these tactics are old and the state security mechanisms have developed enough knowledge and experience to counter these. So new forms of tactics or tools are likely to be developed by terror groups. In this regard, the chapter focuses on synthetic biology and its possible use by terror groups. So synthetic biology, while there is no clear definition, it aims to improve the process of genetic engineering, and its origin lies in the Human Genome Project, which started in early 2000. And the most significant tool that it gave was CRISPR. The full form is clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats.
Can you switch on your video? We're not able to see.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think
yes. No,
there's some network issue.
Yes.
Yes.
No, it's fine.
So what CRISPR does is, let's say you have one specific DNA strand, and there's an enzyme called Cas9. If you're able to apply those two Cas9 enzymes to specific places, the DNA sequence actually cuts off, and you can replace it with another DNA strand, and it holistically changes the entire DNA sequence. So can such tools be used to develop biological weapons? The answer is yes. In 2007, the State University of New York, with significant backing by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, they were able to develop an artificial polio virus. This brought them severe criticism by the US Congress. However, it was highlighted that this entire process required significant backing by DARPA in terms of equipment, academic literature, and budgeting. So my point here is that although biological weapons can be developed through synthetic biology, there are three stages. First, you acquire the necessary tools and equipment. Then you use the academic literature to develop those biotoxins. And the third is the maintaining the lethality of the toxins and then deploying it. So three stages, and there are three different levels of difficulties in all of this. In the chapter, I used two specific cases when such processes were used to deploy biotoxins. First is the case of Shinrikyo in Japan. This was a cult operating in Japan, which in 1995 used sarin gas, a chemical attack in Tokyo subway. But subsequent investigations found out that they also made previous attempts to deploy anthrax. They were able to develop a biological laboratory for themselves. However, the terrorists that were part of this cult were very young, and while they were able to understand some of the technicalities of CRISPR and synthetic biology, they were not able to maintain anthrax as a weapon. And the next case I used is from 2001, right after 9/11. It was in New York, and several letters laced with anthrax spores were sent to several addresses of high officials and government buildings. CNN, some Supreme Court justice offices were also targeted. 5 casualties and 17 infections later, the authorities realized that such groups exist and can harness these alternative ways of terror. So one argument that I make in the chapter is that conventions like Biological Weapons Convention and Chemical Weapons Convention, these are international treaties among states, and it does not consider a possible use by non-state actors or any terror groups or any groups with malicious intent. Through the pandemic, we have seen even a low-intensity outbreak can cause severe damages because the focus of the state and the government shifts to mitigating that damages. Used by terrorist groups. Here, I would like to mention the principal-agent relationship. Like in a hypothetical situation, a rogue group can acquire such weapons if backed by, let's say, another rogue state, because as mentioned earlier, the process requires significant backing. And in the case of Shinrikyo, we see that they were able to acquire the tools, they were able to make use of the literature and knowledge, but in the final phase, the deployment, they failed. So how to mitigate this? There are certain mechanisms that I have used as examples, primarily from the US. Surveillance and preparedness is the essential element in countering or mitigating any form of bioterrorism. So if we divide these strategies on 3 different levels, at the strategic level, at the command level, and the operational level. There's this JASON group that operates in USA. It's a group of biologists and epidemiologists who regularly discuss what are the new trends in biological research, what sort of toxins can be weaponized. All of that literature is sent directly to the White House, and decisions and policies are made accordingly. At the command level, they have the Laboratory Response Network, which is a network of laboratories supervised by the CDC. The Laboratory Response Network, they also they supervise the trends in biological research, but they categorize all the toxins in threat perception level. The CDC processes these information and then sends it to the higher authorities, to the White House. At the operational level, the CDC or other relevant disaster management teams, they go through regular training processes, how to contain a virus outbreak, how to mitigate or surveil other possible infectants. So this is largely my thought on the issue, that while biological weapons are getting relatively easier to develop and acquire, developing those toxins and maintaining its lethality and then deploying it is a difficult process again, but it can be achieved through significant backing from rogue states. That will be all from me.
Thank you, Ritik. Thank you. Now I'll invite Ambassador Tribunal sir, who has also written a foreword for this book, and to share his thoughts and some of the closing remarks and also his ideas on this book.
Thank you, Abhinav. It is good evening to everyone. It's so good to see Professor Dr. Michael Rubin as well as all our old friends today, and to listen to them. You know, I have read your book on radicalization, the copy that you gave me. And I must say, and compliment you for the immense work that you did, research work, and that is probably the seminal reference that is available today in India on that. And whatever this book, the current one that we have brought out, and a few chapters I was able to read, and now listening to the authors, I find much more depth in it. I must say that this will again be a tremendous contribution to the literature on terrorism and counterterrorism. But the fact remains that the no one seems to be really serious about terrorism, how to counter it. We are still continuing to be preferring my terrorist, your terrorist, couched in the geopolitics, support the states that are indulging in terrorism. The terrorists are being saved, as Dr. Siriparna said, by China. On the other one hand, it says that it is confronting the problems in its Xinjiang province and ETIS and others. On the other hand, it is supporting Pakistan irrespective of whatever Pakistan does. But anyway, that is a part of their geopolitics. We have also seen that until, as you know, the India has suffered from terrorism for over 4 decades. And the terrorism has been an instrument of Pakistan's foreign policy towards India. And that is something that has caused a continuous problem. And we have this policy currently as talks and terror cannot continue together. And even today, it stands despite some strands of cooperation that is going on in certain areas with Pakistan.
Sarah, you're not audible. Jagnasa, you're not audible. I think there is some issue at your end. Jagnasa, you're not audible. I guess you need to unmute yourself. Jagnasa?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Now we can hear. Yes, sir. Yes.
What happened in the middle? It just got lost.
Ah,
So much for the 5G or whatever we call it. Yeah, can you hear me now?
yes, we can hear you, sir. We can hear you. Please.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So India has been working on this for quite some time, and you must have recently read the controversy about the film called The Kerala Story, which talks of a certain kind of terrorism and radicalization and how it works. This is not working. If you are able to hear me, I will shift to my mobile phone.
Yes, we can hear you. I think it's better if you shift your cell phone, I guess. No?
Yeah, I'll just log in with that, please.
Yes.
Bear with me for a minute.
Yeah. Sir, I think you have to log out from your laptop and join log in from your.
Yes, this is what I'm doing.
Please unmute yourself.
All right. Sorry once again for the problem that is happening. This other one is not gone as yet. But doesn't matter anyway. So what I was saying is that something I would like to refer to India's efforts, not only in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where we are seeing and looking at quite a few of the, I would say, the dichotomous behavior and the paradoxes that countries like China are driving it and Pakistan are being part of it. Whereas the basic purpose of this was essentially to fight against the against terrorism. I remember when I was in Moscow in 2002, and I must share this with you, that time when SCO was being founded, I was approached by the Tartar's deputy chief editor, and he asked me, he says, what do you think about Pakistan wanting to join the SCO? So I said that if the organization whose basic purpose is to fight terrorism does it and has a member like Pakistan in the SCO, then I have really no comment. And that's precisely what has happened, because China continued to insist that Pakistan should very much be there. And therefore, the leverage business is continuing even in the SCO. But India continues at every fora to do that. As you know, Prime Minister Modi very clearly mentioned in 2015 when he addressed UNGA that unfortunately, till now, the world has not been able to have a single definition of terrorism. So when you don't agree on the fundamental definition of terrorism, how do you fight it? So therefore, each one on his own. But what India has tried to do now is, as you know, in the BRICS, we have done a great job on that. Basically, the 5 countries agreed, and we had a group which was chaired by India, and that blueprint was actually adopted, the strategy, which gives quite a few things exactly, which have been written by several authors also, but essentially just to degrade the terrorism within the region. India has been directly dealing also with the Central Asian countries. So we have started this sub-regional cooperation on terrorism and counter-terrorism matters, which is extremely important. So you have to move somewhere while the global fight is not easy to get. So I think that that is a very important work that India is doing because it is a great and a very pressing priority for us. It remains for the whole world, but as you know that this threat of terrorism has actually impacted the world quite significantly, and I think that the roughly about 1.5% of the global GDP has been lost on this through the terrorist acts, over $1 trillion impact on the economy. So business, everything suffers with that, while we are already having major problems in the world, but this is something that is going on. So I think that the terror financing, the FATF also needs to be strengthened and beefed up. They're showing some teeth little by little, but at the same time, I think that not enough is being done. So which is extremely important, and I think that this should be a fight which should not have any values attached to it. The only value should be to fight against terrorism, and not that he's my terrorist and he's your terrorist, or justify terrorism as one way or the other. We have seen Taliban was declared as a terrorist state by the United States on the forefront, even attacking the country. Whereas personally, I feel that Taliban, or for that matter, Afghanistan, had nothing to do with terrorism in the first place. They only hit this guy, Osama bin Laden, and they were created by the Americans, as we know, and our friend Dr. Rubin knows it well, and the Saudi Arabia. But today, everybody knows that if you are going to create this kind of a behemoth, then it is going to be very difficult to deal with them. And so it has become a major challenge. Now the travel ban, there have to be a conscious effort, in my view, once again, I'll reiterate, globally, and people have to see that this is a existential challenge like the climate change. You know, this is extremely important because today the technology we are talking about, the technology is best used by the terror groups. ISIS is an example. So we are thinking of the rules, regulations, and these guys know how to deal with that beforehand, and they use it for radicalization, which has been proved by all our friends here in their papers. They are using it to fight, and now that we are going to have cyber terrorism, we are going to have a space terrorism in space. So it is going to continue to increase. Now, if some people say that you have defeated ISIS and now it's no longer there, that's not true. We all know that it has just passed. I don't know how many of you have seen the Kerala story. The Kerala story is just one dimension of it. But I can tell you that since 1990s, when I used to visit this area in Kerala, you have studied or done a great study, Abhinav, on Kashmir. But Kerala has probably the largest number of sleeper cells since 90s. And they have been continuing to exist there and prosper. So we have a long way to go ourselves. The only good thing in India, I can say, is that despite having the second largest Muslim population in the world, our contribution to the terror groups abroad is minuscule compared to that, which is a credit to the Islamic community or the Muslim community in India. And I think that that should be applauded. There is no need for anyone to hound a religion for whatever happens. It is the people. And if I was listening to Dipta Singh correctly, he mentioned about CRISPR. I wish that there was some way to change their genes or genetic combination of such terrorists so that they are not born or they don't become like one, like the biological terrorists. So this is something I would say, and I would like to once again compliment you, Usanas Foundation, Preeti, and everyone for working so hard, and all the contributors. And this book is going to be a good reference point. I think we need to work next steps, exactly how to move forward, then what exactly exists. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your brilliant overview of this book and also your thoughts. In fact, of particular interest to me is your discussion on the problem of this persisting problem of one man's terrorist and other man's freedom fighter. I guess this time we came out of that, those dictums and those old notions. Certainly, terrorism is an existential challenge, is an existential threat to human civilization, and there we need a consensus. The second part you also discussed about the Kerala story and our efforts. I mean, that is also one area I think where we need to completely change our thinking and approach. So in going back to Kerala story only, towards the end of the movie, I saw that some of the perpetrators who were the part of that jihadi radicalization and trapping those females, they are still functioning in Kerala as a small shop vendors. Now the question arises that the way we tackle all these issues is purely from a law and order perspective. It's a very law and order centric approach. Now, if NIA investigates some particular case of terror financing or just let's say radicalization and spends like 100 or at least 500 days of man hours preparing a 13,000, 14,000 page charge sheet, and that also gets rejected, nullified in the court of law. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, what's the whole purpose of doing this exercise, and how does it ultimately help us? So I guess we need to really think and introspect about our overall approach of tackling these organizations, and maybe I mean, we need to go. We need to have a different look, different prism towards even the legal provisions that we have for addressing these issues and these problems. Certainly some of these people like who are teaching in madrasas, and in any random madrasa if you go, they in the common discourses they really adore characters like Aurangzeb. In the recent past I came across the mayor of Srinagar, who is a very prominent member, like very close to BJP, on Twitter, social media, and it's open, like it's in the open source, you can refer to it. He was adoring, he was glorifying Aurangzeb. Now, if you glorify Aurangzeb, that means you glorify Al Qaeda. That means you glorify Osama bin Laden. I mean, it's the same ideology. Now, that is a major problem if we have people who are so literate, so educated, and occupying such big chairs. If they are to this business, they are they are not able to mend their ways, or they're not able to, they're not receptive to some of these problems, then certainly it's a matter of great concern, and we need to be thoughtful about all these things. Thank you very much once again, and also I extend my warm thanks to Dr. Michael Rubin for sparing his time and joining us. I know that we always disturb him at odd hours. It's mostly either in the night or early morning, but he's been very helpful. And also my thanks to your cat. By the way, she also appeared in one of our earlier webcasts. So thank you. Convey my regards to her. And I would like to thank all our speakers and our authors also, Dr. Pathak, Mr. Rahul, Ararat, Kritika, and Rideep, and my Usanas team, Preeti and Shweta. Thank you very much for organizing this brilliant book discussion. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
All the best.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.